Dream Team, it's your boy Neal back with another reaction video, guys. Here we are. How Red Bull's undriveable F1 car was finally beaten. The streak officially over. There is no 11 wins in a row. We stopped at 10. Before we jump in, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. Ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. What we got?
It's finally happened. Red Bull's perfect 2023 is over and Max Verstappen's win streak has ended. We all thought it would take something extraordinary and dramatic for Red Bull to be defeated.
Factual. I definitely thought that. I thought it was going to have to be a crash to take him back.
But actually, all it took was Red Bull to be really, really bad. An already tough Singapore weekend descended into disaster with a double Q2 elimination for Verstappen and Sergio Perez, who both salvaged top 10 finishes but were nowhere near challenging for victory in a car that usually looks like it can win from almost anywhere on the grid. Red Bull already feared this race could be its undoing, but things went even worse than expected. The team arrived at the Marina Bay circuit with some serious concerns based on their pre-event simulations. After qualifying only 11th, Verstappen said simulator work ahead of the event suggested the car would be in a tricky setup window because Red Bull worked on both Singapore and Japan in advance of this double header, and Verstappen said the exact same car felt amazing around Suzuka on the sim. But even considering that, this was still a disastrous outcome as Red Bull ultimately didn't find the correct setup for the unusual demands of
So do they have to switch? Do they not have to, but do they switch the setup for each track? Because of course every track is different. So you switch your setup to find out how to get the most out of your car for that specific track. Do they do that with every race? I'd be intrigued in
disastrous outcome as Red Bull ultimately didn't find the correct setup for the unusual demands of Singapore. The Marina Bay street track grips up faster than anywhere except maybe the Hungaroring. We saw that most dramatically between the first and second runs of Q1, where the track was suddenly around 1 second faster, maybe more, in just a few minutes. That grip ramp up through the weekend played its part in some of the key decisions that took Red Bull's car off into what in hindsight was the wrong setup direction. Red Bull seemed to make some progress with overnight changes for final practice on Saturday, but then made the car actively worse for qualifying, and therefore the race, given parc fermé conditions, meant the setup was then locked in by regulation. So in analysing just what went so badly wrong, we are looking at a car which was put fundamentally in a very difficult setup window by the particular demands of the track, but that should only have taken it from by far the fastest car to a merely competitive one. Missing the setup window then prevented Red Bull from even achieving that. On most other tracks, the RB19 can run a lower rear ride height than any other cars without generating excessive bouncing. That's probably a function of its highly sophisticated floor and a clever rear suspension design. But at some tracks there is a different limitation, that of grounding out the legality plank which defines the legal minimum ride height. Those other cars which cannot run as low as the Red Bull without triggering bouncing, by which we mean all of them, don't need to be concerned about grounding the plank to an illegal extent because they can't run that low anyway. But
see, I don't be knowing about all this with the setups in the cars, and I need to dive into some research and really learn. Right now, I'm just a fan. I love watching the videos. I love watching the highlights. I love watching the races. Even though Max Verstappen's streak ended, I will say Singapore, I mean, it was a great finish. Like, you got 4 cars all kind of fighting. Although it was like, I felt like Carlos was never really under like severe pressure. I mean, there was just an opportunity for 4 different cars to win that race, you felt like. And so I do think that was cool.
Need to be concerned about grounding the plank to an illegal extent because they can't run that low anyway, but Red Bull can. So at Spa and in Singapore, that becomes an issue of concern. Red Bull had to run the car much higher than usual to keep it legal for Singapore, and unlike many of its rivals, its aerodynamics haven't been optimised around such a high ride height. You might remember that Red Bull still dominated at Spa. There, the grounding problem is created by the combination of Eau Rouge's very high speed and the vertical load created by the compression as the cars enter that very steep uphill section of the track. So Verstappen and Perez spent the whole race there backing off before the compression, where everyone else was at full throttle. they were told to actively increase the car's ride height through that section by backing off speed, rather than compromising the downforce that delivers the car's fantastic performance by changing the setup and knocking the ride height out of its ideal range for other parts of that circuit. A clever solution, but with the bumps of Singapore, such a solution wasn't available. And this might have boiled down to a fundamental issue in getting the car to use its tyres properly. Red Bull has been left vulnerable a few times this year, as its race-friendly trait of being easy on the rubber can make things tricky in qualifying with weaker tyre warm-up, particularly on the front axle. Maybe that made the first sector in Singapore particularly difficult for Verstappen and Perez. Drivers were often starting their qualifying laps after crawling around the final sector to ensure they had enough gap to the car in front. But if that was a factor, it wasn't the only one.
Of course you want to... Yeah, I saw... I watched some of the qualifying and I saw that, and they were like questioning whether people should be penalized for this and that, and I guess every driver is trying to get enough of a gap that they don't run into anybody when they're doing their laps, you know what I'm saying? That nobody's in their way, which is understandable.
There were further complicating elements for Red Bull in Singapore, but first let's clarify a couple of red herrings. This was the first race at which revised technical directives regarding flexing bodywork were being applied. Inevitably, there were questions about whether this had neutered a previous Red Bull cleverness, although the suggestion in the paddock and within Red Bull is that's not what happened. The other thing to flag is that Red Bull abandoned an upgraded floor mid-weekend. A tweaked rear wing end plate stayed on the car, but Red Bull was concerned the new floor might be playing a role in its struggles, so reverting to the older spec of floor was part of Red Bull's raft of overnight changes after Friday practice. Though this could hint it did not work with the increased ride height and softer suspension settings that Red Bull used in Friday practice, it's more likely that Red Bull just wanted to remove a variable while it chased solutions to its wider problems. And just like the technical directives, the new floor cannot be a key factor in Red Bull's performance issues either, otherwise Verstappen wouldn't have struggled so much with the old one. In fact, team boss Christian Horner insisted after the race that the revised floor was definitely not a contributing factor. That suggests the upgraded floor will return to the car and probably work as expected, though Horner would not confirm this. But if all that wasn't the real problem in Singapore, what else was? Part of the RB19's usual strength is its relatively soft, long travel rear suspension. It's this which plays a crucial role in allowing the underfloor aero to work so effectively in providing big, consistent downforce as the car's dynamic state changes, making it much less peaky in its downforce delivery than other cars. After sim testing, Red Bull arrived to Singapore with an even softer suspension than usual, at least soft by the super stiff standards of the current ground effect cars.
So it seemed like they definitely did a good amount of work in changing this car to make it legal, to meet all the requirements for the Singapore Grand Prix. And the track is different, so you have to, know what I'm saying? I mean, I guess you do have to set up your car for each track and set it up whichever way is best. And so some of these changes, while they weren't really a contributing factor in the loss, others may have hindered a bit.
But when its drivers went out on track for Friday practice, it was clear that the resurfaced parts of the track had removed the bumps and made the grip level far higher than simulated, way too high for the soft suspension, and so the car was grounding out from the combination of high grip and high roll. But other parts of the track were still super bumpy, preventing Red Bull from reducing the ride height into a more favourable range. The increased movement from the soft suspension was probably also disturbing the underfloor aerodynamics, which would make the car inconsistent and unpredictable. The problem got worse the more the grip increased, as even with an unusually high rear ride height by Red Bull standards, the car was still bottoming out on the track surface. Red Bull ran with stiffer suspension on Saturday in an effort to tame the wildly fluctuating underbody aero balance and the potential plank wear problem, but this just moved the problem around. The car became more predictable, but its deficit of rear grip was, if anything, even worse. Still, in final practice, Verstappen was fourth fastest and just over 3/10 off the Ferraris. Both Red Bulls were in the top 10. If Red Bull hadn't changed anything, getting both cars into Q3 would presumably have been perfectly achievable. But further changes were made, and they created two big problems. The car was massively bottoming out in the braking zones, so every time Verstappen wanted to brake late, his front wheels were becoming unloaded. This killed his usual supreme confidence in the brakes. Meanwhile,
So if they would have left it alone, they really would have been Gucci. But I mean, he who dares wins. You gotta take those risks. Sometimes they don't pay off. Sometimes the risks backfire on you. But Red Bull didn't get to number one by not taking risks. You feel me?
Meanwhile, in the low-speed corners, where Red Bull had been struggling already the whole weekend, the car was producing hardly any rear grip, leading to small slides and sometimes some really costly big ones. As Verstappen said, when it's like that, there is no lap time, hence the double Q2 elimination. The race, which ran at a slower pace owing to higher fuel loads and the need to manage escalating car and tyre temperatures, disguised these problems to an extent, but it still wasn't possible for Verstappen to charge his way through the pack into the leading group.
Nah.
We've gotten used to seeing Perez qualify badly and charge back towards the podium while Verstappen dominates races from the front. But Verstappen too has occasionally had to fight back from difficult qualifying sessions. In Saudi Arabia, he started back in 15th, but came through easily to second place behind Perez. In Miami, Verstappen started 9th, but still won the race comfortably.
That's crazy.
But Singapore proved a challenge too far. At some point, Red Bull's winning streak was inevitably going to end. As Christian Horner put it, to win 15 races in a row in F1 is insanity.
Facts.
And in this race, they just gave themselves far too much work to do.
That's complete facts. And then it was that who was it that effed it for him? Was it Logan Sargent? Logan Sargent getting that safety car out there nullified their hard tire strategy, and that completely screwed it right there. So maybe their strategy could have paid off without the safety car, but the strategy that they went with, Logan Sargent crashing and bringing out the safety car, completely made their strategy crap. It made their strategy useless and worthless. And I mean, sometimes things go your way. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and they just were not lucky in this situation. Everything that could go wrong, it seems like, went wrong. But shout out to Carlos Sainz for an absolutely incredible race. He was awesome.
Insanity. And in this race, they just gave themselves far too much work to do. Red Bull's own pre-race simulation predicted a 7th place finish for Verstappen. And given two cars that started ahead of Max on the grid, George Russell's Mercedes and Esteban Ocon's Alpine, both retired, Max finishing 5th is about in line with that prediction. Verstappen was certainly more competitive in race trim compared to qualifying, and he came very close to beating Charles Leclerc's Ferrari to 4th, but the leading group was always just out of reach. As Verstappen himself acknowledged, the timing of the safety car periods didn't help Red Bull strategically, and in fact, Horner feels Max would have been right in the mix.
Strategically, the worst possible lap for the strategy we were on. Facts.
Red Bull's strategy of starting on the hard tyre and then switching to the medium played out as intended, but it's still doubtful Verstappen would have been able to get all the way from 11th on the grid to 1st, and certainly not with the ease of which he has done so at other circuits. That's because the teams immediately behind Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes and McLaren, have all improved their cars recently, and a circuit like Singapore, where overtaking is notoriously difficult even with the aid of DRS, helps protect those with a track position advantage. Ferrari was the team that ultimately grabbed the opportunity to end Red Bull's winning run. There was talk amid the heroic failure of Ferrari's ultimately futile attempt to beat Red Bull at Monza that Ferrari was finally beginning to make strides in properly understanding how to unlock pace from a car that has proved extremely difficult to make work for most of 2023. And in Singapore, on much higher downforce settings than at the Italian Grand Prix, Ferrari was able to top all 3 practice sessions as well as take pole position and then win the race with Carlos Sainz. There are a couple of things that really stand out about this result. Firstly, that Sainz has now out-qualified Charles Leclerc for 3 consecutive races, which suggests Sainz has made a breakthrough on his own side of the Ferrari garage, given Leclerc has something of a reputation as a qualifying master in F1.
I used to think Leclerc was faster than Carlos too. But something might be changing. Something might be in the air here.
Secondly, that Ferrari was able to win a race that required extreme tyre management in incredibly hot and humid conditions. Ordinarily, given its historically superior form in this regard, you would expect Mercedes to have a clear advantage over Ferrari in a race where tyre management is key, but Leclerc was crucially able to get ahead of Russell at the start, which allowed Sainz and Ferrari to control the race from the front and back the chasing cars into a tight bunch, making it more likely those chasing cars would overheat their engines, overheat their brakes and overheat their tyres. And although Mercedes threw everything at trying to take victory, with George Russell even crashing out, so hard was he pushing at the end of this race on fresher tyres, ultimately Sainz had just enough pace in hand to hang on. He finished more than 21 seconds ahead of Verstappen's Red Bull. OK, the Fat Max had to pit between two safety car periods, extended that gap a bit more than otherwise would have been the case, but we've gotten so used to seeing him dominate race after race by at least 20 seconds or more, and it was almost incredible to see fortunes reversed to such an extent. Red Bull's first loss of the season wasn't a close run thing, it was a comprehensive defeat.
Also, big shout out to Lando Norris. Absolutely incredible job at the end, fighting off Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. That's all we got. You guys got a favorite video suggestion? You can subscribe to Patreon or drop it in the comment section. See your boy D Neal out.